Good morning, everybody. Good morning from a cloudy and quite chilly morning in Lisbon. Hope we're all well and enjoying such a great event. And thank you, AviaDev, for inviting me. And last but not least, but I think on the consultant's window, but maybe the tide is turning.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Gavin, for joining us. And I believe we have a poll ready before you start. So let's launch the poll.
Absolutely.
Where Gavin is asking about EU legislation is quite strict on what tourism boards can support in relation to air service development. So if the question is, if EU rules were to change, which of the following would allow for tourism to develop greater links with route development? So please vote now. You think that it's best would be to allow to negotiate support for unsold empty seats with carriers? Or the second option, underwrite guarantee to support ACMI or charter operations? Or focus on using minimum revenue guarantees that allow carriers to receive cashback when revenues are not achieved? Or the last option, offering incentives to raise capacity based on additional flights and passenger volume increases? It's quite close, and we see that most of you, the 43%, think that offering incentives to raise capacity based on additional flights and passenger volume increases you think is the best option. So over to you, Gavin.
Thank you, Orion. Some very interesting points that I'll pick up on. As I was just about to allude to, I think, in the good old days of aviation and airport development, tourism boards were a little bit aloof from the project. I think there was a belief tourism boards do promotion and airports discuss and negotiate with airlines. Well, that is no longer the strategy, and it should not be. And as Erasmus once said, it's in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Maybe tourism boards, the power has come back. Maybe it's tourism boards now. I didn't see any comments mentioning that tourism boards might fail. I certainly saw people negotiating and discussing what is the future of airlines and airports. And I think tourism boards are in a very strong position to really use this crisis in a way to understand what next. If we go back to the days when tourism boards were being invited to the table, it was quite obvious. There was a simple question: how much money do you have? And hence why we asked that poll, because for those of you who know the way that the EU works, incentivizing aviation on behalf of governments leads to much legislation and obviously the horrible word of state aid and using monies illegally. So there's a minefield that goes around what tourism boards can do and what their role can be in negotiating. So the past was, what do you have? It's changed. What do airlines ask today? Is there demand? Is the destination open? What are you doing to ensure that when passengers arrive, that they can enjoy the experience? So the mood has shifted from how much do you have to what can people do? Which brings us back to that original question: what is the role of a tourism board? It is, of course, to create demand. And so whilst we have a situation of potentially excessive supply, and finding aircraft is not the problem today, but finding enough people to fill that aircraft is obviously one of the challenges that tourism boards need to work together with their partners to be able to try to understand how we create new demand and where do we want that demand to come from. The future is going to be quite different. The future says it's not who I compete with. It's not to say my destination competes with your destination because my beach is larger or my sea is warmer or my landscape is better. Maybe the challenge in the future is we compete on an industry that will be smaller. The aviation industry will be smaller. There will not be as many aircraft in the next few years as there's been. So actually what we might start to see is competition on the potential of where airlines will fly. And that might mean that we come back to the discussion of what incentives do you have? but it's in a way that says, how do we reduce risk together? Because what airlines will be asking themselves is, which routes have the greatest potential for profitability? And where we put those aircraft will make them that decision on where we fly, not based on who's got the best destination. You might have a fantastic destination, but you may not seem to be there with the aviation profitability, which then left the question we asked, how do governments support developing supply where that supply is now weak? And as was being discussed in the last panel, if airlines are to fail, what does that then mean to destinations that are reliant on lift from certain markets where that lift is no longer available? How do we turn to supporting third-party aviation? Under the EU, that is not allowed, but maybe the decisions, and in the new normal, everything is open for negotiation. So coming back to what I've been asked to consider, where might tourism boards reinvent? I think the first point I would like to address is, how do you rework air services development? What is the role of tourism in supporting aviation? Is it about incentivizing lift, or is it about creating demand? If the airline's argument is that we need profitable routes, we need consumers. And so the destination's effect is, how do we try to reignite the reason to travel? Why fly and why visit? Because that then will drive the airlines to say, I'm seeing demand, the capacity will come in line with what's being requested. Previously, it was try to stimulate demand by incentivizing supply. Let's throw capacity into a destination and hope that people will make bookings. If that capacity is not there, we have to rework the project. How do we stimulate demand? Which comes back, as I've said, what is the role of tourism? Is to create the awareness, create the dream, redevelop that dream, and reassure the airlines that the destination is safe, is welcoming, and is doing what it can do to really position it is in your interest to fly. So the first one is incentives versus insights, let's call it. Not thinking about how much you need, but thinking about how we can help, how we can reduce your risk in bringing you to my destination. Secondly, it's about demand, as I've been saying, stimulating demand. For those of us that have been through these previous crises, particularly September 11, there was an amazing reaction by the consumer, reduced price, and people forgot. I haven't seen that so far. Yes, there has been, and in the last Becca mentioned that Ryanair had emailed flash sales. Other airlines have done similar, but it's low key, relative. If we think about the promotion of aviation at the moment, it hasn't been a big, we're back, here's loads of cheap fares, please start traveling. So the demand generation is not coming through fares, or demand generation is not coming through the reduction of fares. What we need to start thinking about is how we stimulate people to want to travel again. And that's what the airlines need to understand. How does the airport and the tourism destination work a lot closer to be able to offer incentives and demand generation projects that give confidence to the airline that whilst we've got less flying, it's in our interest to serve your destination. So I think this whole project of not about wanting to discuss incentives per se, but it's very much about where we engage with airlines to tell stories. In the other part of AviaDev with John in Africa, we ran a masterclass on competitive advantage. And one of the things we talked a lot about was the importance of engagement and trying to reduce risk. And I think this is one of the real ways tourism boards can get out of this. They need to lead the discussions that we're open, we're willing to support, be it in promotional activities, in ways of trying to address the support mechanisms that the EU allowed certain destinations to deliver, and then have confidence from the airport that the incentives and the packages available to be able to bring airlines back into the destination. And the third one is all about repositioning, how to reposition what we do in relation to managing connectivity. As I said, it felt as if destinations were at the end of the story. Airports and airlines were together, talking, negotiating, and then all of a sudden, let's get the tourism people in because they may have some money. No, let's do it the other way around. Let's define the destination's vision. Where do we want to be? And which source markets do we believe will drive that new vision? And then let's talk to the airport and let's talk to the airlines and say, this is what we want. Are you with us? Do you see vision with us? Let's talk about moving forward. The first poll, Juraj, that you put up was that we see the strategy of the change of this pandemic to reignite, to redevelop things. That's why I use the quote of Erasmus. I see tourism driving the next 2 years of route development because there's money. And of course, the difference between allowing airports to manage the relationship with airlines, the KPIs are completely different. A tourism board is, in a lot of examples, is monitored on bed nights. It does not monitored on passengers. How many of those passengers stay in hotels? If we're making our accounts on the economics of tourism, it's quite simple. We're looking at the revenue generation that's coming from hotels. And it's hotels that we need to fill, not passengers. How many of those passengers might arrive into one country and drive across the border to another country? How many of those passengers that come and rent properties through the likes of Airbnb, that if that's not being declared back into the coffers of the government? So I think tourism boards have got a real drive now that says, we're not going bankrupt. Governments are going to have to really understand where they define the vision of tourism and lead the discussions with airlines and airports. It's in the interest of the destination to receive tourists, and it's the interest of the airlines to fly to those destinations that the demand is coming through the natural causes, not by incentivizing lift, which actually we probably won't have because those planes will be grounded. So the model has changed. And I think that's what I'd like to highlight, reworking the agreements, stimulating demand, and the whole concept of value propositions. And maybe tourism is no longer the last part of the discussion, but it's the first part of the discussion. Maybe that's throwing up some questions that you will come to. Let me finalize and go back to the poll. Thank you for sharing your ideas. I'm quite intrigued that we didn't have a higher number of the first two, which are the ones that were the kind of the bellwethers back in 2018, 2019. Oh, wouldn't it be great if governments could actually pay for empty seats? Wouldn't that really help? Because we can put more capacity in and not worry. And I'm happy to see it because, of course, in the new world, if we could call this the new world, it isn't about just throwing capacity into a destination. As we've said, people are not buying travel because it's cheap. They're buying travel if they really feel that they can get an experience. So your 43%, your eye on offering incentives in the new world, I agree with. And I think for tourism boards, it's never been a better time to take some leadership in negotiating on behalf of the airport and the airline in that triangle approach. I will leave it there and offer any questions or discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gavin. I think we have time for one quick question. Chloe from Regional Gateway is asking, given domestic and regional travel is expected to recover, should partnerships between regional airports and airlines and local tourist boards be where the focus is in terms of investments and support? So the partnerships. Good question.
I think it's always where the decentralization lines of the government between central tourism and national tourism and regional tourism. So obviously in all countries, it's slightly different in how those monies are divvied up. But I think it makes sense that there are times when if the central is working a certain vision, that there's an alignment then with the regional discussions, and why not have some of the regions also. I think where we've got to be nervous is not to throw money central and regional without coordination. Otherwise, we're just going to go back to what we were doing in the past, which is supporting supply. I think there needs to be a lot more coordination between what is the central vision and the regional vision, and trying to align the strategies of where the destination or the country is positioning itself, and then how the sub-regions can work in certain areas. Otherwise, let's be honest, you'll have the airports and the local tourism competing with each other. And it will be like the old days, oh, well, your airport at the other side of the country offered me more money, so do I go there? And I think that's why I'd like the tourism to take lead and have a strategic vision that says, if it's not central, regional, regional, central, discuss ideas, and then have a coordination to work the airports and the airlines together. You know, let's look for synergies and not have airports and local tourism competing within the same country for demand.